Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next session in Mr. Snyder's psychology class. This is on the experimental method and ethical issues that we must consider in psychology. So let's get started. Your learning targets for today are to explain the experimental method, to identify the purpose of measuring the central tendency and dispersion, and listing and describing three overarching ethical issues in psychology. At least three. We're going to mention some more. So, the experimental method. Going back to our last lesson of correlation, correlation cannot define causation. The only way to allow researchers to determine the cause of a behavior is the experiment. In an experiment, researchers deliberately manipulate the variable they think is causing some behavior while holding all the other variables that might interfere with the experiment's results constant and unchanging. That way, if they get changes in behavior, or what we would call an effect, they know that those things must be due to the manipulated variable. For example, remember when we talked about the scientific method, I used the example of watching violent cartoons and the effects on children's aggressive behavior. The most logical way to study that relationship would be using an experiment. So in that experiment, the variable the researchers think caused changes in aggressive behavior is the actual violence in the cartoons. So we would want to manipulate that in some way, and in order to do that, we have to come up and define the term violent cartoon. We would have to find a cartoon that contains violence or make one. Then we would show the cartoon to the participants and try to measure their aggressive behavior afterwards. In measuring the aggressive behavior, they would have to define exactly what they mean by aggressive behavior so that it can be measured. This definition is called the operational definition because it specifically names the operations or steps that the experimenter must use to control or measure the variables in the cartoon. An operational definition of aggressive behavior might be a checklist of very specific actions like hitting, pushing, so that we can mark off as the children do the items on the list. If the observers just were told to look for aggressive behavior, we each have a different perception of what that is, and we would get half a dozen or more different interpretations of what aggressive behavior is. What we're measuring, what we're looking for are variables, and those are factors that can vary or change. And the name for the variable that is manipulated in any experiment is the independent variable, because it is independent of anything the participants do. They do not get to choose or vary the independent variable, and their behavior does not affect this variable at all. In the preceding example, the independent variable would be the presence or absence of violence in the cartoons. The response of the participants to the manipulation of the independent variable is a dependent relationship. So the response of the participants that is measured is known as the dependent variable. Their behavior, if the hypothesis is correct, should depend on whether or not they were exposed to the independent variable. And in the example, the dependent variable would be the measure of aggressive behavior in the children. The dependent variable is always the thing that is measured to see just how the independent variable may have affected it. If the researchers do all of this and find that the children's behavior is aggressive, can they say that the aggressive behavior was caused by the violence in the cartoon? No, what we've described so far is not enough. The researchers may find that the children who watch the violent cartoons are aggressive, but how would they know if their aggressive behavior was caused by the cartoon or if it was just natural aggressive behavior of those particular children, or the result of the particular time of day they were observed after they had a sugar-filled breakfast? These are what we call confounding variables, or variables that interfere with each other and their possible effects on some other variable of interest. These are the kind researchers have to control for in some way. And the best way to control for confounding variables is to have two groups of participants: those who watch the violent cartoon and those who watch a non-violent cartoon for the same length of time. The group that is exposed to the independent variable is called the experimental group because it is the group that receives the experimental manipulation. The other group that gets either no treatment or some kind of treatment that should have no effect, like the group that watches the nonviolent cartoon in the example, is called the control group because it is used to control for the possibility that other factors might be causing the effect that is being examined. If researchers were to find that both the group that watched the violent cartoon and the group that watched the nonviolent cartoon were equally aggressive, they would have to assume that the nonviolent content did not, that the violent content did not influence their behavior at all. And hopefully, as you've already learned about when we talked about samples, random assignment of participants to the experiment or the control group is the best way to ensure control over other interfering variables. Now, we need to talk about the placebo effect and what a placebo is. A placebo is a substance or treatment that has no effect apart from its person's belief in the effect. So this is what the control group would get. For example, let's say there's a new drug that is supposed to improve memory in people who are in the very early stages of Alzheimer's disease, which is a form of mental deterioration that occurs in people as they grow older. So let's give the experimental group the pill. Let's give the control group a placebo, or a pill that looks like the other pill, but really does nothing. So the group that gets the drug would be the experimental group, and the one that doesn't is the control group. And getting or not getting the drug is the independent variable, whereas the measure of a person's memory improvement would be the dependent variable. What if the researchers do find that the drug group had greater memory improvement than the group that received nothing? Can they really say that the drug itself caused the improvement? Or is it possible that the participants who received the drug knew they were supposed to improve in memory and therefore made a major effort to do so? The improvement may have had more to do with the participants' belief in the drug than the drug itself, a phenomenon known as the placebo effect. The expectations and biases of the participants in a study can influence their behavior. So in medical research, in this instance, we would give the control group, rather than giving them nothing, we would give them a sugar pill or an injection of salt water, and this substitute, and it has no medical effect, that is called the placebo. If there is a placebo effect, the control group will show changes in the dependent variable, even though the participants in the group only received a placebo. So it's a major, pretty cool phenomenon that just because a person believes that something is working, it actually is. So here are some ways to control for the placebo effect. Let's talk about the single-blind study first. The classic way to control for the placebo effect is to give the control group an actual placebo, some kind of treatment that doesn't affect behavior at all. The participants in both the experimental and the control groups would not know whether or not they got the real drug or the placebo. That way, if their expectations have any effect at all on the outcome of the experiment, the experimenter will be able to tell by looking at the results for the control group and comparing them to the experimental group. Even if the control group improves a little, the drug group should improve significantly more if the drug is working. This is called a single-blind study because while the experimenter knows which participant is taking which treatment, the participants are blind to the treatment they receive. They had to introduce a double-blind study. And in a double-blind study, neither the participants nor the person or persons measuring the dependent variable know who what got. So we call those people the researchers. The researchers nor the participants know what treatment they got. That's why everything in a double-blind experiment gets coded in some way, so that only after all the measurements have been taken, anyone can determine who was in the experimental group and who was in the control group. Because that's the control for the experimenter effect. Because the expectations of the experimenter, if he knows, or the researcher, if he knows what each group is getting, he may be biased and interpret them better. And so in a double-blind study, only the experiment organizer is aware in a double-blind study. In a single-blind study, both the researcher and the experimenter organizer are aware. In a double-blind experiment, the researcher is unaware to control for any bias, and the participants are unaware, but the experiment organizer is still aware. So more on analyzing data. In psychology, we look for the central tendency or the average score of a distribution. Ways that we do that are the mean, median, and mode, which you are familiar with from math class. The mean is the average, the median is the middle score, and the mode is the most frequent score. Each is important because each is a different way of measuring central tendency. The researchers use the range and standard deviation to document the variability of a score. So range, you know, is the difference between the highest and the lowest score. But standard deviation is a measure of distance from every score to the mean. And I'll show you what I mean right here. So these 1 standard deviation units, so -1 standard deviation units, -2 standard deviation units, -3, those are all distances from the score. And you can see 34.13% of the participants scored here, 34.13% scored here. But the mean is here in the middle. This is a perfect bell curve that we see, and the score would be the mean right up here at the top, right there. Now, let's go on to our third learning target and discuss ethics. Ethics are standards put in place for proper and responsible behavior, and the organization in charge of this is the American Psychological Association, and they established these guidelines that are in your book, in the back, in the appendix, that psychologists are required to follow, and if not, they can risk being losing their license, being kicked out of the APA, which is a very prestigious group. But let's go over how to do research with people, and there's a difference between people and animals. People, let's talk about first. Standards limit the type of research that psychologists may conduct with people. A lot of the experiments we're going to be talking about are old, and they were helpful. We did learn stuff from the experiments, but they were probably unethical by today's standards. The leading principle is that study participants may not be harmed, and some of the people were not physically harmed, but psychologically harmed in the older experiments that we're going to be looking at. So let's talk about confidentiality. Confidentiality is very important because psychologists treat the records of research participants and clients as confidential. Otherwise, they may not get true data. People may not be willing to reveal that much about themselves. Only in certain cases may psychologists disregard confidentiality, and those are basically when the person may become a danger to themselves or to others. Informed consent, all volunteers must provide informed consent. And what that means is that people agree to participate in the study only after they receive a general overview of the study and have been given a choice whether or not to participate. We can't force people to be in psychological studies. They must give consent, and that consent must be informed. They need to know what study they are being in, they are taking part in. Deception. Some experiments cannot be run without deceiving people. And so these new drug experiments and other blind studies cannot be conducted without keeping participants unaware of the treatment or the nature of the study. So basically, the good must outweigh the harm that comes from deception for them able to do it. And we follow APA guidelines when we must use deception. And then also during the debriefing process afterwards, participants have to be told why the deception was important and why the study wouldn't work any other way. Ethics in using data. Psychologists use and follow strict ethical rules in how they produce, store, and present their data. They need to be objective when conducting a study in order to avoid bias, because this data could change the way people think about things. We talked about the belief that vaccinations cause autism, but that has not been backed up with science. But that was one study in the 1990s that used flawed data in order to get that belief. So that guy was not willing to throw out his hypothesis in light of contradictory evidence collected in the research. It was unethical. Here's how we resolve ethical issues in the APA and some of the 8 ways that we resolve ethical issues. Now, research with animals. Some of the reasons psychologists use animals are they live shorter lives, so looking at the long-term effects becomes much easier. Animals are also easier to control, and we can control their diet, their living arrangements, and even their genetic relatedness. The white laboratory rat has become a recognized species because different from ordinary rats. Because it's a little genetic twin of all the others. They control how they breed it. Animals also engage in much simpler behavior than humans do, making it easy to see the effects of the manipulations. And the biggest reason is that animals in some of the research can be used in ways that researchers could never use people. For example, it took a long time for scientists to prove that the tars and other harmful substances in tobacco cause cancer because they had to do correlational studies with people and experiments only with animals. There's the catch. Researchers can do many things to animals that they can't do to people. It may seem cruel at first, but when you think that without animal research, there would be no vaccines for deadly diseases, no insulin treatments for diabetics, no transplants, and so on, then the benefits to humankind far outweigh the hazards to which the research animals are exposed. But the ethical consideration is that most psychological studies that use animals do not harm the animals. And some of them do conduct research that may be harmful to animals, but they only do it when it cannot be carried out with people for ethical reasons. They only use animals when there is no alternative and when they believe the benefit outweighs the harm. And the APA, some people still believe that it is no more ethical to harm animals than it is to harm people, but the APA has rules, strict rules and ethics for how animals used in research should be treated. And that is the end of our lesson today. I hope you found it insightful. Be sure to study for the test coming up.